There's something in the female archetype with regard to like Beauty and the Beast, or a modern Beauty and the Beast would be, what was that sex book that everybody read in like 2013? 50 Shades of Grey.
I read it twice.
Okay. Welcome back to Power of the Mind, the podcast where we give you simple tools to help you understand yourself and others. Today's podcast started off with a joke Elicia told last week and got us off on all kinds of really interesting tangents discussing who we date and why we date them. Somebody asked, hey, how come I keep dating people who are just like my mom and my dad? If you're curious about that, stick around. We've got an answer for you.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Cast 11 Network with Power of the Mind, presented by Granite Mountain Behavioral Healthcare. What's up, Greg Struve?
Not a lot. It's a good day.
It's a good day. It is a good day.
It is a good
I feel
day.
good today. I joked with you when you walked in. They often will put little snippets up about, our podcast, and on this particular one, they did an outtake. So I always feel like I'm towering above everybody, so I always lower my chair. Is that a sign of power or struggles?
It's about your mother.
Wanting to have intercourse with my parents or something. Is that a
that was
thing?
I was gonna slow play that, but yeah, I'm sure there's a podcast for that. I'm sure. That's a good snippet. That's
apparently
funny.
They hit record way before we knew that they were hitting record. Right?
Yeah, there's some dangerous stuff in there, I bet.
Mm-hmm. I think they were planning on using it for blackmail, but then realized, I don't care. So,
instead of blackmailing her, let's just put it on Instagram.
Let's just put it
and
on.
call it a day.
Be funny. So this particular one was talking about, me just being funny because I was adjusting my chair, and, my wanting to be above everything. Is it a sign of power, or, what's going on in my head? And it's somehow just morphed into intercourse with parents, and how crazy that would be, from
that
Freud.
Escalated quickly.
Yeah, escalated quickly. But I loved how you just rolled with it.
Well, it's the old Freudian thing. Freud was known for a lot of things, but his probably most well-known thing was this Oedipal complex, the idea that human beings have some sort of interest in engaging intimately, shall we say, with their parents. And so it's kind of a fun fodder if you're a therapist to tell jokes. And then Freud also, a lot of Freud's material came back to the relationship between the mother and the child. Most of Freud's stuff, I think really kind of stopped evolving after about the first 3 years of life. And after that, you were kind of a pinball in a machine, more or less. That's oversimplifying it, but it's not. It's closer to the mark than perhaps the Freudians would like it to be.
So there's something to be said with the fact that, because I know you've mentioned before that you pick a mate, you're either marrying your mother or your father.
Well, usually both, yes. It's interesting, we can critique Freud, and there's a lot of critiquable things about Freud, but the man was a genius, and the biggest genius about Freud is he was kind of the first person in modern culture to present to the world the idea that there is an inner landscape, a personality that can be modified or changed. We take for granted that idea now. We don't think much about it, but it was kind of wild and crazy back in the day. And the idea that some of these things could be changed, and that the environment might have had an influence in who and how I am, as opposed to us just sort of popping out that way. And particularly what the environmental influence, how it might manifest in terms of the relationship with the parents and the children. That's very much Freud's contribution to the zeitgeist of the culture. So it's kind of neat. But yeah, you definitely see a lot of overlap between a person's parents and their partners. And the reason for that, I think, is biological as opposed to some of the Freudian underpinnings of it. If you think about it, now we all come from a history of a very harsh world, very cruel, harsh world. Everybody says, I love nature. Well, no, you don't. You love the pretty parts of nature. Yeah. Right? But you love nature when you're on the top of the food chain. Right. As soon as you're off the top of the food chain, your relationship with nature becomes nuanced, shall we say.
Yeah. You wake up in the middle of the jungle.
Right. Or, if there's some wolves in nature, your thoughts on nature change. Mm-hmm. And they change pretty quickly. Like the canyon isn't as beautiful if it's filled with things that might eat you. Changes quite quickly. And so when we take that into consideration, The reality is that for an awful long time, most people didn't live to adulthood. There's a pretty small percentage, relatively speaking, of folks who were born who lived into adulthood. I know we've talked on the show about the fact that the Romans made a practice of not naming their children until the age of 6, in part because their kids just didn't live that long. So people, they tried not to get attached, more or less. And that is a practical and not entirely silly idea in a world where an awful lot of your kids die either during childbirth or the first couple of years. They catch a cold, they get an infection. I was helping somebody move and I got a big cut in my finger and it got a little bit infected. And I was telling my wife, what a blessing that I live in a world where when I get an infected finger, it's a nuisance. Mm-hmm. There are other situations where people get an infection and they just die. Right?
Yeah.
That's the...
Or we just start cutting it off.
Sure.
How high did the
hacking
infection
it off
go,
and
right?
seeing how it goes. Yeah, that was how they did a lot of surgery back in the day. That was a doctor's job during war is, here, bite down in this piece of wood. We're going to saw your arm off. Ugh. So we forget all of those wonderful changes that came around. And around 1900, the electricity became commonplace. And with electricity, suddenly you could do surgery, you could do anesthesia, and some of those things started to show up. Actually, I can't remember if that was connected to electricity or if it was just about the time that surgery and anesthesia became a thing. But regardless, so anyway, we get back to this idea with our parents, the fact that my mom and my dad lived long enough to procreate. And then there was a certain percentage of men who were just not able to get married and find partners, right? So my father lived long enough and was competent enough to attract a mate in some way, competent enough, hopefully. And then, my mother chose that mate and therefore they had me. Well, the fact that both of them lived to the age of reproduction makes them pretty exceptional. And so if I have to figure out, how am I going to select a mate from this large pool of potential candidates? How do I pick my mate? Well, one really smart way to decide is to say, well, my dad, he lived, and he wasn't particularly nice to me necessarily, but he survived and protected my mother well enough that we survived.
Right.
And my mother, she lived through childhood. Whatever it is she did, it seemed to be enough to find a mate. So both parents found a mate. Maybe I should model my ideal mate after some of the traits of both of them. So from a biological perspective, it actually just makes a lot of sense.
So what if you're in the boat where my older children picked really bad guys for a while? And so is that considered a rebellious thing, or is that, do you look at that and go, oh gosh, that's a reflection of how they see you, or is it?
Well, you'd have to get into the specifics of the quote unquote really bad guys. So again, picking a partner who has some of the characteristics of both parents. We also all want a partner who's a bit of a challenge, right? Nobody likes somebody who likes them back completely. Interesting study by John Gottman, where he talked about the idea, he studied marriage, and he's been really effective in studying marriage. I think I've talked about this stat too, the idea that you have a 5-to-1 ratio of positive to negative if you want to stay married, generally. Less than that, you're not going to make it. But if you have more than an 11-to-1 ratio of positive to negative, doesn't pan out, we get bored, move right along. So that's an interesting question. What I generally look for if somebody is choosing people who are difficult to be with, there are a lot of things that can contribute to it, but one of the biggest ones is if I have a self-esteem problem, sometimes I'll find a partner who can manifest that problem for me. So if I beat myself up internally, maybe I could find a partner to do it externally. So that's a piece of it. I would look for violence if there's violence in the relationship. Sometimes I can look for violence in the family line and find that to be there too. It doesn't always have to be with the parents. Sometimes with the grandparents, it can go back a little bit. So that's always an option. And then the other challenge that we have is sometimes people can be, the opposite challenge can occur where a person just comes out of the family system a little bit naive. And that's one problem that I think it's underplayed. There's a responsibility of parents to teach their kids about the world and to prepare them for the fact that not everybody is, well-intentioned. Yeah, so that can be part of it too.
It's funny because as I said it, I was thinking about my husband, and he was a rebel. He was I don't want to say the bad guy, but he was like, I remember I was dating the clean cut, perfect guy. Parents loved him. And that was like, but this guy over here. So that's the one that I went for, the harder to get, the bad boy. So maybe that's, and then I think my kids did that. So it's like, maybe that's the connection too. I don't know.
There's something in the female archetype with regard to like Beauty and the Beast, or a modern Beauty and the Beast would be, what was that sex book that everybody read in like 2013? 50 Shades of Grey.
I read it twice.
Okay. So what was so intriguing about that book? Why would that book sell 400 million copies? I think it was I think it's one of the most read pieces of literature of the century so far. And what it was you had this very strong, very, very competent, very dangerous male, okay, and a woman who tamed him. And in the book, he would eventually, and you'll see this in kind of every single romance novel ever written, more or less, right? And Beauty and the Beast is sort of the PG version of it. Like super impossible, crazy, scary, competent, very sort of dangerous man, and the woman tames him, and he confesses his need for her and her alone, her uniquely. He needs her uniquely to everyone else, and there is something deeply moving about that. But again, from a biological perspective, that would make a lot of sense. If there's a limited amount of food, there's a pretty strong hierarchy in the tribe, and the people who are higher up in the hierarchy get to eat. And the reality is that biologically, in a difficult situation, nowadays we have a lot of abundance. We don't have to do this anymore, which I think is kind of nice. But in a situation where there's not much abundance and not much, we're living off the land, so to speak, strength is pretty important. And women generally are not as strong as men. And so your best bet would be to align yourself with the strongest, if not the strongest person necessarily, the strongest group of people. Because that's the other challenge in selecting a mate or selecting who you want to align with, is one person, the strongest and meanest person, probably can still be beaten by a group of less strong, less mean people.
Right.
So anyway, as a person looking for a partner, nice and kind is not always going to be what we're looking for long-term on a biological innate level. Strong and mean and tameable is infinitely more exciting and probably biologically quite a bit more useful.
Well, yeah, because the thought of, with my husband, everybody's kind of intimidated by him.
Sure.
And for me, I'm the one who could tell him, take out the trash, and it's like, oh yeah, I'm doing that right now. And trust me, it's not that easy, but it is like, I'm the one person that can, I see the vulnerable side of him. I see and nobody else gets to see that. And there is something, when I think about that, it is enticing, and it is, like, wow.
It's very attractive.
I took this guy that was, just the tough dude, and, he's jelly in my hand, and that's very cool. It's like something to, I don't know, it's just. And
it can be a very successful partnership at that point too.
Yeah, it has been.
I mean, if we think back to the family side of things, family was so much more important back when people were less mobile. You know what I mean? Back in the day, you would not necessarily leave your tribe, later on your sort of kingdom where you lived, because you needed your family to survive. And so, competence played a big part in partner selection too. And that's one thing, a person doesn't have to be marvelously attractive all the time. If they're just really good at something, that can be very, very attractive to potential partners. And so that's something to think about as well. If your husband comes from a family that's particularly gifted at, I don't know, back in the day, hunting or gathering or planting or whatever, blacksmithing.
He's a great blacksmither.
I was thinking about this the other day. I like the idea of maybe lightening up a little on history and on the injustices from the past. Obviously a woman is equally intelligent and competent at jobs of any kind, and women can and should hold any particular job that they're looking for. Back in the day, the jobs were not much fun. Nobody wanted to sign up to be a blacksmith.
Yeah.
Like, that's a tough job. You better be big and strong and blacksmithy. And there probably were a limited number of the economy is only going to support, in any little given town is only going to support a few of those anyway. So yeah, just the idea that we should apply today's standards to the past, I think, is a little silly. There's a lot of material happening back there that we can't, or the church shaming people around sex. Well, that was birth control until like 1950. Prior to 1950, that was the only birth control we had.
Shame.
Hey, you're bad. Keep your pants on. You're bad.
You got like 6 kids, lady.
Yeah.
What are you doing?
Well, seriously, now again, I don't think it was very kind or gentle or sweet, and it certainly probably wasn't very pleasant. But the alternative was to bring a child into the world who had to be fed, and if that child was born out of wedlock, that meant there wasn't an existing system in place to feed the child other than, growing elderly grandparents. That's not great.
Right.
That's a tough deal. So anyway, I think we sell ourselves short if we get too upset about the ghosts of our past. Part of the challenge we have is we live in so much abundance now that we can change the rules and fiddle with them a little bit, and there's no danger in it. And back in the day, you messed with something, the whole system could come crashing down. You don't know.
Right.
There's a lot of merit in doing it the way it's been done. And if you want to experiment, you can, but don't forget that if you do something different and the crops don't grow, come this winter, you're
messed up, right?
It's going to be a different deal. So anyway, that's sort of an aside. But yeah, so I think that's, if we get back to it, why do I pick the partner I pick? There are a lot of factors to it. Imago therapy was developed by a guy named Harville Hendricks. Hendricks wrote a book in the 90s, I think, or the 80s. And I think it might have been called Imago therapy. I can't remember what it was called. But that talked a lot about the idea that we pick a partner based on an archetypal representation of both of our parents, their best qualities. And then we'll also pick 2 or 3 qualities of them that we don't want to find. And invariably, we will find them anyway in our partner. So that's kind of fun too.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it was funny because I was thinking about, for me, I've shared several times that, childhood wasn't ideal. It wasn't as if I was never abused or anything as a child, but, my mom and dad's relationship was pretty volatile. And I remember the first time I saw a picture, or Frank was posing for a picture, and he had a little girl in his lap, and they were taking like a little family picture. And his hand was like on the shoulder of this little girl. And I looked at that and I went, those hands will never hurt me. Like, those hands will protect me. Right. And I remember that thought. I was like young at the time when I was first set laser focused on him, 15, 16 years old. I was like, that's the guy, that's the one I'm going to marry. But yeah, I remember it was opposite of my dad. Sure. I watched, the relationship between my parents, and we're like, oof, even though my dad always took care of me, it was just, there was a strength in knowing that he's strong, but he's never going to use it. Again, that was just kind of the way I saw that. So, but there are similarities in my husband and my dad, just in the fact that, no matter what, I always knew we'd be protected. My dad was going to protect us, not my mom, but always going to protect us. But, and that's how I look at Frank. So I was just trying to think why I chose, because he's different than my dad personality wise, but I knew he would, be a good provider and take care of us. So it's just kind of always how I looked at Frank. But
yeah, well, there's an element to I remember in graduate school, one of my favorite professors said, ask a 13 or a 12-year-old, ask them what the 2 or 3 biggest mistakes that their parents are making with them are. And they'll tell you every time.
Yeah.
What are the biggest flaws, the character flaws of your parent? And then they will set about to avoid those flaws in adulthood. Every teenager will pick 2 or 3 things, which again, biologically makes a lot of sense. It kind of comes back to what I was saying before. Don't change too much.
Right.
But do change a little bit. Be better than you were, but be careful.
Right.
Because the experiment you're doing, these bodies are fragile. You can mess them up pretty easy. So don't change too much, but change a little bit. And so that was before I got into any kind of evolutionary psychology. This was just basic Adlerian. I went to an Adlerian school. Basic Adlerian training said every kid will pick 2 or 3 things about their parents that they don't like. And then they change them. So that's an interesting thing to think about with you is you probably looked and said, well, this stuff didn't work for my parents. I'm not going to do that.
Yeah. Never will I ever need a man for support. I will always make sure I'm self-sufficient. Never will I ever do drugs or, any of that because it's so, but there were things that my mom did that were, it was something like anytime we'd have dinner, she served dad first. You always serve your man and then you serve your kids and then you always eat last. And I have always done that.
Really?
Dad gets,
so that's an interesting,
I serve dad
like
first
said.
and then the kids get served and then I, take the plate at the end. And so that's always just been the way it is. And I tell you, if my kids come over and their husband makes their own plate, I'm like, you take care of your man. What are you doing? But it's just something that's always stuck with me. Like that's your man. You take care of your man. And I know I'm going to get flack from, women like, oh, he should take care of you. And he does, but
Sure.
That is the one way that I'm always, and sometimes if we're, and if I'm in a mood, like, well, I'm ready to eat. Well, then make a plate. What is your,
Yeah.
But he's so used to like getting it served to him, which, but it sounds silly to say it out loud, but that was the thing that my mom always, took care of my dad.
It's like a really good example though of what we're talking about, right? So you pick some things where you're like, man, I am not going to be like my mom in this way.
Yep.
But then if there are for a lot of us, there are many, there's thousands and thousands and thousands of little tiny things that we don't think of and that we do. And we do that because we don't have another template. There's infinite ways of being in the world. And there's too many decisions to make too fast. You see this in particular with parenting, particularly parenting an infant. There is too much going on to really sit and think through what to do. Once in a while, people read a book. But even when you read a book, usually the book sits in there for a couple of weeks. Once in a while longer, but not too long. Unless you decided your parents really, that can be one of the choices you made when you're 12 or 13. Man, my parents wet the bed. They crapped the bed with me. I'm not doing anything like they did. I'm going to read a book. I'm going to listen to podcasts. I'm going to find a different way of being in this world as much as I can. Yeah. Although eventually what you dislike, you tend to become. But we go back to what worked.
Right. Yeah. Those were just
as
good
a general
things.
rule. Once in a while we'll change things up. That'll change, particularly if there's a big religious conversion too. Different. If I change cultures. I'm marrying into a different religion, or, there's some argument to be said that there are now probably 2 cultures in America. So if I shift from one of those cultures to the other, significant differences might apply because the cultural norms are so divergent from one to the other now. But as a general rule, and even then, even when that shifts, there's still going to be a bunch of changes, a bunch of or a bunch of similarities from where I came from to where I am now.
'Cause I definitely know, I've got friends from different cultures, and there's definitely the culture that is take care of your man, you make his lunch, you serve his dinner, you clean his clothes, and he's the protector, the provider, the, mows the lawn every Sunday or whatever. And then there's the other culture that's like, he has 2 legs and 2 functioning arms. He can, serve himself. And so I see that very much.
You even seem like you have the conflict there, right? You're talking about how this is the way I do it, but then there's a party that says, well, geez, people are going to give me crap because that's not the way you're supposed to do it. And that's, again, part of the cultural divergence there. It's like, oh, we've shifted in that way, for better or for worse. Yeah.
Well, and I think too, there's
a pressure.
There's a
move
pressure.
in a different direction.
Yeah, because you don't want to be that, this is equal. This should be an equal partnership. We should all be doing our part. So,
well, one thing, would you like some feedback?
Yeah.
One thing is that based on what you're describing anyway, your relationship works. And there's an awful lot of relationships that don't work. Most of the first year of marriage, or, if a person doesn't get married and they live together, although I think that's a challenge too, because what happens if you live together and then get married, till death do us part brings up a whole different part of the psyche. I think we talked about that in a different episode. So you end up kind of with 2 crap sandwiches instead of just one. Some other time we'll get into that. But that first year or so that you're living under a roof and sharing an environment, one of the things you do is you just fight about everything. And the reason you have to fight about everything is you have to figure out a system that works. And man, oh man, I hesitate to get in the way of somebody who's found a system that works. It is a tough deal.
Yeah.
And it's incredibly complex, much more complex than we can write a book about or give it credit for. So
32 years.
Look, and you like each other, at least some of the time. I mean, that's something.
Most of the time.
Yeah.
Most of the time it works. I mean, there's times when, you've talked before of the 5 to 1. It's like, usually if they're kind of mean, or they do something that's kind of annoying. It's like, he probably didn't mean to be annoying.
Right.
But there are times, like the older you get, where it's like, he's trying to be a problem right now. It's like the things that you used to be okay with, or you start getting a little more oh gosh, this again, or whatever. But 32 years, that's good. So I'm safe to say that I did choose, because as I talk it out, I'm like, okay, I did choose somebody that's kind of like my dad.
Sure.
But I think I'm more like my dad than my mom when it comes to certain things. So just much more like my dad than my mom. But no intercourse with them. We're not doing that. So we're not coming back to that. That's
I didn't
Freud
see that
was
coming
a little.
At all. You brought that one out of left field.
Freud
that was
was
impressive. That was a little surprising.
It's outtakes.
Yeah,
it was outtakes. It was warming up for the good stuff. But
we frown on that.
Yeah, it's definitely
generally frowned upon.
But it does make sense that, these are people that you've admired your whole life, and, they did good, right? They brought us into the world.
Anyway.
Well, for the most part.
Yeah.
Maybe.
About
most of the time.
Yeah. It depends on a person's background and experience. Although ironically, even if a parent doesn't do well, and we don't admire them, they still live long enough to create us. And so sometimes we'll seek out a duplicate anyway. Yeah. Even if I have a mom or a dad who's like woefully abusive, or an alcoholic or a drug addict, biologically I'm still trained to chase that down. That's
your mama. No matter what, it's
biology. It says they survive, the next one will probably survive too. Let's go find one kind of like this.
Yeah.
And off we go.
Well, and there's a fierce protection of your parents too. It's,
for many people there is, yeah.
I would defend my mom and my dad to anybody, to the ends of the earth, but I don't want to be like them. I don't want to, whatever. It's like,
everybody makes
mistakes.
Everybody makes a decision. Often they can make the decision really, really early, sometimes pre-verbally. Usually it's in adolescence, but everybody makes a decision like, I'm with this family or I'm against it. And it's biologically pretty dangerous to make the decision like, I am not going to be with this family, I'm going to be against it. But there are people who have a difficult enough family situation, or who just dispositionally are so different than the people, because we are born with a certain disposition. We have a series of traits that we come into the world with. So there are folks who will decide, these are not my people, very, very early. They Did you really?
I did that at, it was probably 12 and a half. And as much as you would try to, you've got to quit putting yourself in these situations.
Yeah, right.
Things have to change. And by then, you know, it was the second marriage for my mom. My dad was single. And it was, if you're not going to change the situation, because she went out of the frying pan right into the fire with the next mate and husband. And it was, if you're not going to change the situation, I got to go. Yeah. And so, and by that time I was really rebelling against her and the situation and just, you know, very uncharacteristic of what I should be doing. Mm-hmm. But it was just, this is not a good environment. It's not, you know.
Yeah. Well, generally by that age, you know, you would just decide adults don't have my back and mm-hmm. I'm going to have to make it on my own.
Yeah. Well, and I went and lived with my dad, and that was, you know, we've talked about this on the hero role where I was the hero for a long time, and then he married somebody and I didn't have to be the hero anymore. And then I was like, oh, I guess I'll just be the rebel then. I guess I'll just be bad. But so interesting how much I've learned about myself and, you know, everything going through these podcasts with you, because it is my weekly therapy session, because it is the being able to speak about things and talk about things and just kind of analyze them and go, oh.
Well, you get to grow.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You get to look back at things. And as human beings, we really enjoy the experience of putting a name to something that didn't have a name before. Mm-hmm. We really enjoy that part of knowledge and learning. And so to look back and say, oh, here's what happened, and here's how it happened, and here's why it might happen, and mm-hmm. here's how that might impact me now. You know, we love that.
Well, and there's things I did where I'm like, gosh, why would I tell my mom I'm going to go live with my dad? You know, why would I do that? And there's a few, like, rebelling after I moved in with my dad and he got married. It's like, why would you mess up something so great? You know, you're living in this great house. Yeah. You know, everything's going well, and you rebel and, you know, just, and so after talking out with you, I'm like, that's why I did it. It wasn't my fault. I was searching for my place in the family, and my role had been taken, so I had to find another one. So that's
there's a lot of truth in that.
Yeah, you fixed me. So no guilt now. It's not my fault. It's Freud's fault.
Freud's fault. We can blame Freud. Yeah, the blame, the self-blame piece is so interesting, and to look at the balance between the environment and our choices, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, ultimately, yeah, it's like it's not anybody in that situation might have made a similar, and maybe would have likely made a similar choice, and the only one who has to deal with our consequences is us.
Yeah.
Right? That's the big thing. So, well, we should wrap up for today, I think.
This has been a great
conversation. Thanks for hanging out with me.
Yeah, thank you. It went a couple different rabbit holes as
Meanders.
Meanders.
Good old meandering.
I dig it. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to you guys for tuning in to Power of the Mind with Granite Mountain Behavioral Healthcare and Greg Struve.
For information about mental health and addiction treatment, you can reach out to Granite Mountain Behavioral Healthcare online at granitemountainbhc.com. That's Granite Mountain BHC.com. Or give us a call at 877-338-6287. That's 877-338-6287. If you have a comment about this podcast or a question you'd like us to address in the podcast, you can check out the Contact Us page at my website, gregstruve.com. That's GREGSTRUV as in Victor, E as in Edward.com. This has been a Cast 11 production brought to you by Granite Mountain Behavioral Healthcare. Follow Cast 11 on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest at Talking Glass Media.